Good evening from Australia and a warm welcome to a very special Asia Society event, the launch of Disruptive Asia Volume 4, Sustainability of the Asian Century. I hope you're all keeping well and safe, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Thomas Sohn. I'm the Executive Director at Asia Society Australia and curator of our 2020 Disruptive Asia publication. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. I'm currently on Gadigal land here in Sydney. I would like to acknowledge all traditional owners and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge and like to welcome any Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or First Nation people joining our webcast today. We are thrilled and very proud to be launching Disruptive Asia Sustainability Special Edition today, delivered in partnership with major sponsor WWF Australia, knowledge partner the University of Queensland, as well as the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism and Ideas. An idea and initiative by CEO Philip Ivanov and editor Greg Earle, Disruptive Asia is a thought leadership project and publication by Asia Society Australia, launched in 2017. It presents new perspectives and policy recommendations on how Asia's rise is impacting Australia's foreign policy, economy and society, and how Australia should respond. This year, at the dawn of the so-called Decade of Action, and with only 10 years to deliver the 2030 agenda, we have turned our attention to the rise of Asia and its impact on sustainable development. We have asked the question if Asia's rise is sustainable environmentally, economically, and socially. While Australia, Asia, and the world has been faced with the worst pandemic in over 100 years, we can't afford to lose sight of the Sustainable Development Goals. So this year, we have brought together experts to analyse and debate key sustainability issues at a time when the rise of Asia is having profound impacts on our society, our economy, and the environment. We have also presented regular and interactive webinars to bringing the authors and contributors together to discuss some of the key issues and themes. So I would like to take this opportunity as well to thank all of our contributors this year for being involved and for sharing your time and expertise with us, and for making this edition such a special one. We are incredibly proud of what we have achieved this year and are really grateful for your willingness and interest in being part of our project. I'm also thrilled to announce a new dedicated website for Disruptive Asia. Thanks to our partner and graphic design company, Boheme, it will provide a new public platform for an accessible, live and ongoing conversation about Australia's future in Asia. It will house a catalogue of currently 4 volumes and close to 80 essays, and be a repository of all future editions, profile all our authors, and be the home to a popular webinar series. I also like to thank again our sponsors, WWF Australia and the University of Queensland, for your support and contribution and for making this website possible. I'd also like to thank the Judith Neilson Institute for Journalism and Ideas for their ongoing support this year of the publication as a whole, and acknowledge the very important work J&I does in supporting journalists and quality journalism and reporting on Asia. I encourage everyone to explore their new project, Asian Stories. Finally, allow me to give a big thank you to our editor-in-chief, Greg Earle, who has been editing Disruptive Asia since its very beginning and is so important to this publication. A special thank you also to my colleagues, Eloise Dolan and Andrew Tice, for your hard work, great ideas and enthusiasm, and also to our CEO, Philip Ivanov, and the rest of the team here at Asia Society. So finally, it now gives me great pleasure to in order to celebrate the launch of this year's publication and the new website, we are really thrilled and very honoured to bring you a live discussion with a truly incredible panel of international sustainability experts. Leading our conversation tonight it is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Desi Anwar, Senior Anchor, Director and Correspondent at CNN Indonesia, and International Advisory Councillor at the Judith Nielsen Institute. Desi, a very good afternoon in Jakarta to you, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, Thomas, and hello, everybody, wherever you are. I hope you're all in great health during these challenging times, and it's my great pleasure to moderate today's live discussion with this star-studded panel. And over the next hour, we will be considering the question which has been guiding the Disruptive Asia series throughout 2020. And that question is Asia's rise sustainable environmentally, economically, and socially? Now, this question has become all the more pertinent. As you know, we are nearing the end of this unpredictable year. And of course, we need to rebuild towards a new normal into the decade of action to deliver the UN 2030 sustainability agenda. And Jakarta, Indonesia, where I join you from today, like many countries in the region, we are also suffering as a result of COVID-19. Now, we are a resource-based economy, as you probably know, and our economic success in recent years has come at a high environmental cost. Now, while Indonesia, like many other countries, is committed to the UN SDGs, the increasing pressure of an economic bounce back is making the divide between theory and practice even greater, especially when it comes to ensuring sustainable growth and development. So, like our viewers, I personally am very much looking forward to understanding how we can bridge that divide in this uncertain area so that our economic growth does not come at the expense of our environmental condition. Before we start our discussion, a little bit on housekeeping. So today's event will run for around 60 minutes. We're now at 2:09 in the afternoon in Jakarta. We'll spend the first 40 minutes with our panelists, and you will have some time at the end to ask questions to our panelists. So please, if you have any question, submit it in the YouTube live chat box. And without much further ado, it's my pleasure now to introduce our expert panel for today. And you can see the background on our incredible expertise of our speakers in the following link we are sharing with you right now in the YouTube chat box. International conversation today. Joining us from New Zealand, we're honored to host the Right Honourable Helen Clark. Helen is former Prime Minister of New Zealand, former UNDP Administrator and Global Leader in Sustainable Development and Gender Equality. Hello, Helen. And from Geneva, we are joined by Pavan Sukhdev, President at WWF International. Pavan, good to see you. And from Melbourne, we are pleased to present Anna Skarbek, and Anna is CEO at ClimateWorks Australia. And finally, joining us from the Philippines, and this is via a pre-recorded message later in the session, we will have Dr. Bambang Susantono. Bambang is Vice President for Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development of the Asian Development Bank. Now, let's start our discussion for today. And if we're talking about the 2030, particularly SDGs agenda, and in light of the current COVID-19 pandemic, let's start with you, Helen. How do you think sustainability will fare as the region is tackling the current pandemic? And particularly, how do we balance the immediate recovery efforts with solutions that are long-term? And of course, what do you think success with the SDGs is tied to the success of dealing with COVID-19? Helen?
Thank you, Desi, and good evening from New Zealand to everyone. I think success with the SDGs is absolutely premised now on dealing with COVID-19. Now, there are other things that have to happen too, and we'll get on to the climate crisis and other issues, which are also major challenges to achieving the SDGs. But we're not going to get anywhere now if we let this pandemic rage on. The reality is, and we can come back to this, the SDGs were in quite a bit of trouble before the COVID-19 pandemic. They're in a lot more trouble now. By May, more than 100 low-income and middle-income economies had applied to the IMF for emergency support. What does that tell us? it tells us that government budgets have had carnage done to them. It tells you that there may not be the money there to do the things that need to be done to push human development and investment in the kinds of things we'd like to see for green infrastructure forward. So this is highly problematic. The longer the pandemic rages, the longer it will be before we can try to turn around some of these very adverse trends. Now that leads me to make a point about the critical importance of a people's vaccine. We have to have an equitable rollout of a vaccine, because otherwise what one could foresee is that countries with the means and capacity will vaccinate their people and they'll get on with life and leave the low-income countries in particular, and marginalised people in other societies, to grapple with the ongoing COVID disease becoming endemic. So you increase inequalities between countries if some are able to get on with a more or less normal life and others are left struggling behind. I don't think we want to live in that sort of world, and it's moving further away from the reducing inequalities theme of the SDGs. So in brief, on the recovery, look, it's a chance for a reset. We all know that. For investment in inclusion, in sustainability, in resilience, for not going back to the way things were. Will it happen? It's going to need incredible leadership, because GDP has been so damaged by what has happened that I have a concern that there'll be a rush back to business as usual to try to regain lost ground. And that would overlook the reality that you can have a very strong green economy which will deliver the human development and well-being gains that people seek. But it takes leadership to push that forward.
Yes, obviously leadership is very important now. The goal for 2030, I mean, 2020, it's 5 years since the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals itself, Helen. So what does the 2020 SDG report tell us of progress against the 17 goals? And obviously this pandemic is kind of, messing things around a bit, but where must our focus be to ensure that we can deliver on this very ambitious agenda?
Well, the 2020 report is so bleak that you have to go away and get a cup of coffee almost in between reading about every goal. It's not good. So what is now being forecast that on the current trends, and given what's happened with COVID, far from eradicating global extreme poverty by 2030, it will be sitting at 6%. Well, that's quite a way off. Far from having every child able to enjoy 12 years basic education, we're looking at 200 million children in our world not being out of school by 2030. The hunger figures were rising anyway before COVID, and we now have the head of the World Food Programme, which just got the Nobel Peace Prize, talking about biblical levels of famine in our world. On health, we're looking at the possibility of reversal of decades of progress if we can't get on top of the pandemic. And let's not even start on the issue of climate. I mean, my understanding is that still the commitments that countries have made under the Paris Agreement take us to a 3-degree future, not a 1.5 one. We desperately need more ambition there. So look, what I would focus on to try and turn this around fast on climate, absolutely move out of coal, move out of fossil fuels as fast as you can to the alternatives that are there. The forest conservation and restoration is extremely important. You need climate-friendly agriculture, which also protects our biodiversity. On the human development side, to tackle extreme poverty, we need universal social protection. What was one of the most searing things we heard when the lockdowns were in full force around the world in that March-April period? Poor people saying, I'm going to die of hunger before I die of COVID, because 4 billion people in our world have no basic social protection. We have to invest in that to put a floor under people's living standards. We need universal health coverage, genuine universal health coverage, and we need inclusive education that can carry on in the most adverse events like a pandemic. So look, in a sense, everything's a priority, but if we come down to it, zero in on the poverty, zero in on getting the children into school, zero in on the universal health coverage, and zero in on the issue of the deforestation, the fossil fuels, and what will protect our biodiversity.
Okay, well, unfortunately, the COVID-19 is a health crisis that comes with very, very harsh economic consequences. Over to you now, Anna. Anna, you're the CEO of ClimateWorks Australia. The Transforming Australia SDG Progress Report 2020, that was released last week. So what's update? What's Australia's scorecard?
Yes, it's hot off the press from my colleagues at Monash University's Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And it builds on work done a couple of years ago and assesses Australia's performance against a set of 56 indicators linked to the UN's SDGs. And so importantly, it makes some great contributions in actually proposing a set of quantitative 2030 targets for Australia across these 56 indicators, economic, social and environmental SDG goals. And then it assesses Australia's progress from the year 2000 towards that. And also evaluates the effect of COVID on Australia's capacity. At a very high level, the report shows that Australia is performing well in health and education, but is failing to reduce carbon emissions, waste and environmental degradation, and to address cost of living pressures and economic inequality. So of those 56 indicators, in fact, only 12 were assessed as on track to meet the desired 2030 targets. 23 are off track and 11 are classified as needing a breakthrough and another 10 of needing continuous improvement. And as Helen has noted, the report shows that COVID has exacerbated trends, including high levels of unemployment, poverty and psychological distress that were emerging before. So there are deeper findings that are of interest in the economic realm around COVID. It was women, young people, those without high school qualifications who were more likely to have had their employment disrupted. On the positive side, Australia has relatively low levels of government debt, which will help in the COVID recovery, but household debt is higher than the OECD average, and wealth inequality has increased significantly. And Indigenous life expectancy has improved, but remains well below the national average. And of course, on environmental, Helen has already mentioned climate. Australia is well off track to meet a 2030 emissions target that would be consistent with the Paris Agreement goals of keeping global warming well below 2 degrees. And of course, our emissions per capita remain very high. On the positive, total forest area has increased steadily in the last decade after a period of decline. But our own research shows that vastly more plantations will be needed in revegetation to help achieve our climate goals. So that links back to COVID and highlights that there is a huge opportunity to design a COVID recovery strategy that begins to substantially address climate change and strengthen our resilience to future shocks, as well as ensure long-term sustainable prosperity for Australia. And it really is an important moment. And I think lastly, it also highlights the value of data, of metrics and of measuring progress. And I know from our work with investors that the financial sector's interest in aligning with the SDGs and aligning with the Paris goals will drive a higher demand for transparency around this progress tracking. And obviously the digital revolution will enable more transparency. And I hope that this will accelerate the use of metrics to guide this race to the top towards achieving these goals.
Okay, obviously challenging a decade ahead of us. Still on metrics and measurement, Pavan, WWF, how do we ensure that these reports and metrics and measures of progress or impact are being used to design solutions that can hopefully lead to more implementation and more action, as well as, of course, very importantly, accountability and transparency?
I think you're right to concentrate on metrics. You cannot manage what you do not measure. But I think also let's look at the progress that's been made on that. At the macro level, the United Nations has been publishing for quite a few years now, 2012, 2014, 2018, a report called the Inclusive Wealth Report, which looks not only at produced capital increase per capita, which of course is also indirectly measured by GDP, but it also looks at human capital and natural capital. And I think looking at reports like that and relying on them more and actually participating better, because as you know, garbage in, garbage out. So it is the responsibility of governments to input well into these reports and contribute towards their quality. So I think looking at a lens which is wider than the GDP lens is important. But I think also at the same time, looking at SDGs, my own company has been involved in micro level metrics. And I'm very pleased to report that investors these days, global investors, asset managers, are asking me for SDG analysis of their portfolios, not just profit analysis or even capitals analysis. That's a good sign. Yeah. So I hope this direction moves.
Yeah, of course, we do need the metrics and measurements, but also financing is very important, obviously. Let's go back to the financings of it all, the Sustainable Development Goals. Helen, sustainable financing obviously remains a major bottleneck to achieve the SDGs. And has COVID-19, well, I would have thought COVID-19 has compounded this further. So how do you assess the state of suitable financing as we progress into this decade of action?
Well, again, COVID has been a setback. I think I see three major areas of financing. One, domestic resource mobilisation. The second, the international development grant money, both for more traditional development and also the environmental funds like the Green Climate Fund, plus the concessional lending that can come from the international financial institutions. And then you have the private sector investments as well. Now, domestic resource mobilisation's taken a hit with COVID because of what's happened to economies, obviously. International development finance is also not looking so bright. People may have noticed that in the last day, the British government has announced that it's backing away from its 0.7% official development assistance proportion of GNI down from 0.7 to 0.5. Now, Britain has been, if you like, a development financing superpower. So this is very, very concerning. And it wouldn't be unlikely, I think, for other donor countries to be taking a similar approach. And then, to the extent that the private sector has been impacted, as clearly parts of it have very significantly, that has an impact on investment as well. So I think for countries, it's really a question now of thinking very hard about how you're going to make your luck to boost your domestic resource mobilisation. In one of the previous questions, there was a reference to transparency and accountability. Absolutely the time to dust off the plans for anti-corruption, rule of law, making yourself, as bulletproof as you can with that, so that what should be going into the tax revenues goes in and then can be spent appropriately. I chair the board of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and we're all about bringing it out into the open. What should be being paid in? Where did the money go? Fighting corruption. Secondly, the development partners really do need to stay the course. The reality is that the least developed countries can't achieve the SDGs without the solidarity that comes from grant finance and from the concessional finance. The Green Climate Fund has never really got the level of resources that was hoped for. So we need the partners to come forward and support these things. And then for the investors, let me say one thing I found very encouraging last year was this sustainable finance initiative that the UN Environment Programme facilitated, which was launched at the UN General Assembly. And at that, there were principles for responsible banking launched. And there were the companies who signed up to that to align their strategies with achieving the SDGs and with the Paris Climate Agreement represent about a third of the global banking sector. Now, that's not a bad start. So I think a lot of the investors are getting it, that this is really extremely important. And I can only encourage more to put their flag up where that first 1/3 of the global banking sector has got to.
Obviously, it's a challenge for the government now here in Indonesia. Also, the Indonesian government having to, finance the the economic fallout from COVID-19, as well as focus itself on ensuring social services and growth of the country. Let's go over to you now with Anna. Coming back to policy settings, what do you think of the governments? What can they do to enable more sustainable investment, particularly in our regions? And what's the trend among Australian investors when it comes to sustainable finance? And how does it impact our trade and investment with key Asian markets?
The trend towards sustainable finance is, as Helen mentioned, rapidly advancing, really gaining strong momentum. Just this week in Australia, ASFI, the Australian Sustainable Finance Initiative, launched its roadmap, which indeed endorses the call that Helen referred to from the UN Principles of Responsible Banking about aligning portfolios with the Paris Agreement goal of net zero emissions by 2050, and indeed encourages all financial institutions in the Australian sector to do so, and provides a range of recommendations on how to do it, how to influence the leadership, the staff, and the instruments, the disclosure. Quite a detailed roadmap, following a trend of sustainable finance roadmaps from other jurisdictions around the world. Those trends are matched also with trends in the range of sustainability-related financial instruments being expanded as well. Examples from Australia include, for example, the Treasury Corporation in Victoria, and issued its inaugural green bond about 5 years ago of 300 million. And also similarly, Monash University became the first university globally to issue a climate bond of over 200 million, similarly some years ago. And just a year ago, Woolworths, one of our largest supermarkets, raised $400 million from 90 institutional investors in what was then the first green bond issued by a supermarket operator in Australia. But we are also seeing governments in the region taking a much stronger stance. And just this month, ASEAN's central banks called for joint action on climate risk. And indeed, the central banks and monetary authorities unanimously agreed that the region should come together to take action against climate environmental risks in their recent report of the task force on the roles of ASEAN central banks in managing climate. And so similar themes from central bankers in Australia, as well as the ASEAN central bankers, which included Malaysia, Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam. So really taking it seriously. And more locally, where you are in Indonesia, ADB, the Asian Development Bank, has been partnering with Indonesia on some interesting new loans. Just recently, ADB approved $600 million US loan to PLN for renewables to support the grid development, but also to address the cost of substituting coal-fired power and diesel power for renewables. And a new transition bond also being issued by ADB with PLN, and that will be what we think is the first green thematic to be offered to the capital market. So some really positive trends around the financing. And on the policy front, we're seeing carbon pricing advancing, perhaps faster than some Australians might realise, that following China, Japan and South Korea, countries now, including Indonesia, Thailand and Vietnam, are underway in developing carbon price mechanisms. And just last week, Vietnam passed the revised legislation that would legalise an emissions trading scheme in Vietnam. There's quite a lot more progress to report, but that's just a flavour of some of those trends.
Yeah, and obviously in Indonesia, I see the government is committed to streamlining the green economy, but of course, implementation is always the key in these kinds of things. Now, Pavan, you've been widely recognized for your work on the green economy. So what's your assessment of Asia's path to developing green economies, and what are the prospects for a green recovery in the region, if at all?
Sure. Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize is that the pathways across richer nations and developing nations are different. I think richer nations need to focus more on reducing their per capita footprint, whereas developing nations like my country, India, need to focus more on pathways which are, I would call, green development, or better still, inclusive green development. And that means strategies. Now, one of the key areas in which focus is needed today is infrastructure. According to the Asian Development Bank, in order to maintain GDP growth at the kind of levels that countries are forecasting, we need in Asia something like $1.7 trillion of investment, infrastructure investment every year. And to put things in context, that's roughly like $20 trillion over the next 11, 12 years. And that's almost a quarter of the total infrastructure investment globally. Half of that, 53% of that, according to the ADB, is power. And Asia has this tendency to sort of think of hydropower as the default option, without necessarily always understanding that by installing large infrastructure hydropower dam projects, yes, you may get a fillip to GDP, but you will also get river deltas which are sinking and shrinking as a result of the loss of the flow of silt into those deltas, and agricultural communities, entire agricultural communities being destroyed in terms of their livelihoods simply because things don't grow anymore because of the salination that seeps in from the ocean. You will get loss of fisheries and so on. So I think clear, deep thought has to be required, and hard work has to be done to think of alternatives. There are also deforestation issues with, I mean, you are from Indonesia, and
yeah,
I've been
absolutely
vocal about the Batang Toru ecosystem and the hydropower dam that's been built there just to generate 510 megawatts, which is actually meant for export of power to Malaysia. Whereas in my opinion, as an analyst in this space, a better solution would have been to place a solar project, there's plenty of sun in Indonesia, closer to where the export is, which is literally across the Straits of Malacca. So the resulting loss of the forest, the resulting sort of disruption of local ecology, and to me as a WWF president, the very threat, because that ecosystem houses the only population of the Tapanuli orangutan, which is the world's most endangered great ape. So I think, careful thought and planning really has to focus on these $20-odd trillion of investment, infrastructure investment. Of course, essential for GDP growth and so on, but equally potentially a huge risk to local ecologies, local peoples, their livelihoods, and of course, biodiversity.
Yep. Very important points indeed. We have to be careful also that, shortcuts, in order to achieve economic growth, we're kind of, missing out on actually our long-term sustainability. And it will we're going to be a lot worse off if we don't take care of our planet now, because this is, our only home. Let's focus more on something which is more recent, the US elections and outcome and the SDGs. And obviously the US is not a fan of the Paris Agreement. Let's start with you again, Helen Clark. What is the Biden administration, and let's hope it is a Biden administration, mean for the 2030 agenda? What will this mean for Australia? Is the Morrison government likely to see pressure from the White House to increase its ambitions, for example, under the Paris Agreement? And what does this leave the US-China relationship, as both parties have a renewed opportunity to commit to their landmark joint announcement in 2014 to address climate change?
I think it's clear that the incoming administration in the United States is going to be good for multilateralism. And that means it's good for multilateral agendas. It's good for the 2030 agenda, and it's good for the Paris climate agreement. And I think actually incredibly good news that the former Secretary of State and Senator John Kerry has been appointed as the presidential envoy on the climate change issues. John Kerry played such an incredibly important role in getting the Paris Agreement. So to have him back active and on the case is very, very important. I mean, other areas where the US will be back, well, obviously the World Health Organization. The current administration had obviously said that it was exiting the WHO. That won't happen now. And that will be very positive for the global response to COVID, which, as I said earlier, needs solidarity. We need a vaccine rollout that's worldwide and doesn't leave people behind, and then leave poor countries even further behind, because they can never get on top of it unless there's equitable vaccine rollout. And I think also in US development assistance, that will be positive for the international institutions. When you have a sort of, America alone approach, it tends to focus on what the US itself does. But the international institutions, and I used to lead one, UNDP, we really had tremendous support from the US historically. And I think we'll see some of those levels of support coming back. Now, what does it all mean for Australia? Well, look, I'm speaking as a New Zealander 1,200 miles away, but what I would observe is that any Australian government tries to work closely with any American government. And I think the new Biden administration will, it will be making expectations clear that, you know, that it would like to see Australia probably more on board with the Paris Climate Agreement, for example. On the US-China relationship, I think what I'd say is a lot of the fundamental issues aren't going to go away. The US and China have differences. New Zealand and China have differences. Australia and China have differences. We all know what they are. They're in the area of human rights. They're around what happens in the South China Sea. You know, there's issues of intellectual property, and we can have a long list. But I think a Biden administration will also be looking for what are the shared interests here. And there are shared interests. You know, there's a shared interest in prosperous trade between the two countries. There's actually a shared interest in combating climate change, and both countries can be leaders on that. So I think we'll see, you know, a more diplomatic relationship that looks for the shared interest, while not shying away from expressing what is a disagreement.
Yeah, and let's take a look more at this, you know, Paris Agreement and emission targets. And Indonesia is one of the signatories to Paris Agreement. We actually have quite an ambitious target, reducing by 2030, 27% of our carbon emission through business as usual, with increasing to 41% with international collaboration. Anna, in just the past month, 3 industrial powerhouses of China, Japan, and South Korea have collectively buy 2/3 of Australia's coal exports, have all committed to reach net zero emissions. And what does this mean for Australia? And to what extent do these commitments by our major trading partners, Australia's major trading partners, increase risks and opportunities facing Australia in a decarbonising world?
Well, it confirms that the future is a zero emissions world. And those Asian nations' commitments to net zero emissions by around mid-century, 2050, 2060 in China's case, they are matched by the same commitments in the EU, UK, and in the US from the incoming Biden administration. So the global momentum toward that end goal of net zero emissions has really shifted in the last year. That indeed was the aim of the Paris Agreement and the rhythm. It is 5 years since the Paris Agreement was signed. The whole process was intended to have this ratchet up. And indeed, now there is the acknowledgement that that end goal is achievable, and it is also necessary. It is the only way we secure ourselves a safe and prosperous future. So for Australia, you ask, what does this mean for Australia and the risks and opportunities? And indeed, they are great on both sides. On the risks front, there are obvious economic risks and exposure from our history of high volume fossil fuel exports and our emissions intensive industry sectors and electricity. And also physical risks. Obviously, we're very exposed to droughts, bushfires, and we're with the coastal infrastructure where our populations are facing extreme weather and therefore economic damage as well as physical risks and sea level rise. And then there are the impacts on the Great Barrier Reef and our tourism sectors as well as agriculture. So we are a very exposed country to climate change risks, economically as well as physical. But equally, the opportunities are huge for Australia. Yeah. We are actually blessed with opportunity in the same degree that we are exposed to those risks. We have great potential to prosper in a zero carbon world because we have world-class renewable energy resources. When the combination of wind and solar is best in the world across our landmass. And we have, when I mentioned the landmass, enormous natural capital potential. We have a great agriculture sector. We do need improved soil health. We have very precious biodiversity, and we can integrate improved land management with our agricultural productivity and our significant agricultural exports, and achieve carbon sequestration at the same time with revegetation and land restoration. We also have, thanks to our renewables and land mass and our industrial base, a huge potential to serve the global hydrogen market. And renewably made hydrogen is one of the most enormous and new potentials in a decarbonising world. It is the substitute for the energy and fuel that needs to be transported. And that's what our Asian export partners are focusing on at the moment. So you mentioned China, Japan, South Korea, looking very closely at hydrogen as the way to decarbonise their own economies. And Australia can and continue to be a major world exporter of energy when that energy is clean energy through the form of hydrogen produced with renewable electricity, which of course we have in abundance. And so that, combined with our proximity to Asia, means that Australia really can face a prosperous future in a zero emissions world. And the effort is in this coming decade now to transition our economy of the previous decades to position it for this economy of the future decades. And we know if we can manage this transition well, we really can thrive and help the world thrive too, especially in Asia.
Yeah, obviously green energy, renewable energy. I think innovation and technology is obviously key when it comes to creating these renewable energies. Now, Pavan, what do you think is the role of technology and innovation, particularly for achieving the SDGs? And how can we best mobilize science, technology, and innovation in the quest to meet the 2030 agenda?
Yeah, thanks, Desi, for that question. And it's beyond just a desirable, it's a necessity. And the reason I say this is the following. If you look at employment, global unemployment, structural unemployment was about 183 million people pre-COVID. That's the December number. And according to the ILO, it went up at the end of June to about 640 million. Now, yes, some of these are temporary effects to unemployment, and this is huge to have 640 million and probably now 750 million unemployed. But the point is, some of this is related to the need to change and transition the economy towards a different. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
We can hear.
We need to change and transition the economy towards new models and investments, for instance, in renewables. I mean, it's an old reported result from the United Nations Green Economy report that fossil fuels, basically petroleum, really has a very high capital intensity in production, but labor intensity is in fact to be found much more in areas such as renewables, whether it is wind, solar, or indeed second generation biofuels. So the need to stimulate different forms of economic activity, especially when it comes to renewables. And secondly, and I'm picking on the two areas that Helen Clark also mentioned in her comments, agriculture, our models for agriculture and our models for energy both need to change. This is not an either or. If we look at agriculture, we have such high energy intensity and such high impact, negative impact on the environment. The choice is clear. We need to move towards agriculture which recognizes that actually it's about biology, not chemistry. This idea of high chemical input agriculture, which has huge negative impacts on the environment, firstly is costly to the environment. Secondly, it's not really a solution for the 1.1 billion people who are small farmers across the developing world. They can't afford these. And if they can be subsidized, then their governments cannot afford the fiscal space for those subsidies. So these are not the solutions. The solutions are the kind of natural farming that is coming up all across the world, including in India, the most remarkable case of 650,000 farmers transitioning to natural farming in one state through the support of a joint, as in a public-private partnership in Andhra Pradesh in India. So I think one needs to look beyond our current template and innovate, but not necessarily in a high technology way. Most of natural farming innovations rely upon basic realizations that soil health matters, soil biology has to be restored, and local materials used essentially from animal husbandry can be used to re-inject bacteria, and that bacterial injection into the soil regenerates its health, adds to the increase in nematodes and worms and funguses and so on, which you need to enable soil to generate food for plants. So there are some basic realizations that we've sort of kind of forgotten in our rush for high technology, which I think we need to rediscover, and very quickly. And by the way, this kind of agriculture is climate positive. So it actually captures carbon from the atmosphere, apart from generating higher yield, better employment, lower costs, increased profits for the small farmer. At the end of the day, this is about solving for poverty and solving for employment. These are solutions that are sitting in front of us. Honestly, we should grab them with both arms.
Absolutely, but when we're also addicted to fossil fuels, especially for a country like Indonesia, we're so dependent on our resources, and also the price is much more affordable and cheaper now, so there's just less incentive these days. But of course, innovation, technology, and our global commitment is extremely important in realizing, our green economy and making sure that countries do implement renewable energy and stick to their commitments during the Paris Agreement. I'm afraid. A great discussion. Thank you very much. I'm afraid our panel discussion has come to an end. Thank you, Helen, Pavan, and Anna for our discussion today. But, well, Helen has to leave. Helen, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to see you all. But we are still going to continue our discussion. So Pavan and Anna, please don't go anywhere. And also we would like to invite our audience to send questions to both Pavan and Anna. But first, to follow up from our themes on sustainable financing and the prospect for a green economy in Asia, I'd like to share with you now a pre-recorded messages from our final speaker this evening. We have Dr. Bambang Susantono, Vice President for Knowledge Management and Sustainable Development of the Asian Development Bank, joining us by video. Here it is.
On behalf of the Asian Development Bank, it is an honor for me to join this launch of the 4th Disruptive Asia series on the theme of sustainability of the Asian century. The truly disruptive nature of the COVID-19 pandemic has shifted our focus to immediate needs, but it has also drawn sustainability back to the center stage, environmentally, economically, and socially. So we do not lose sight of the longer journey ahead to fulfill the promise of an Asian century. With that in mind, I would like to share my thoughts on 3 issues. First, the transformations of Asia over the past decades. Second, the disruption caused by the pandemic and our response. And third, the accelerating opportunities that the pandemic presents. Developing Asia has made great strides toward prosperity, becoming the center of global dynamism by embracing openness. In 1965, Asia's share of global GDP was 13%. A little over half a century later, in 2018, it had jumped to 33%. At the same time, real GDP per capita rose more than 5 times to $6,255. In 1980, over 68% of our region's populations lived below the international poverty lines. By 2015, it had been reduced to less than 7%, and more than 1 billion people were lifted out of poverty. Most economies had reached middle income status. What are the key factors that made this happen? From ADB 50+ years of engagement in developing Asia, I would highlight how countries in the regions have created better policies and institutions, nurtured market economies by supporting a vibrant private sector, promoted openness in trade and investment, and embraced globalizations and global agreements. This then led to sustained technological adoptions and innovations. Of course, there have been wide variations with occasional setbacks and reversals. But forward-looking leaders made a difference, as did the idea of open regionalism, which basically means the region's economies enhance trade and investment ties among themselves while still being open to countries outside. An example of such regionalism just happened 2 weeks ago, when 15 economies from the region, including Australia, signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or RCEP. As the world's largest free trade agreement, RCEP members produce about 30% of global GDP and cover roughly 30% of the global populations. After a transition period, the agreement will eliminate tariffs on over 80% of product traded intra-regionally. It harmonized more regulations and policies between members, including favorable cumulative rules of origin, which is very important for firms within regional supply chains. It is expected to add $186 billion to the world economy. This agreement comes at a critical juncture as all nations continue to reel from the shock caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. As 2020 began, we were expecting most economies in the regions to continue relatively strong growth, with developing Asia growing a still robust 5.5%. Then the pandemic hit with devastating economic impacts. An ADB study found that developing Asia's economic losses could exceed 8% of regional GDP, from $1.3 trillion to $2 trillion. Our latest Asian Development Outlook update estimates that the region's growth this year could contract for the first time since 1961 by about 0.7%, before returning to 6.8% catch-up growth in 2021. To support our countries, ADB announced a $20 billion COVID-19 response package by April. The package includes the COVID-19 pandemic response options, or we call it CPRO, to provide assistance within our counter-cyclical expenditure programs, and about $12.9 billion has already been committed in financial grant and technical assistance thus far. We have also committed $1.9 billion to the private sector for direct financing, rejuvenating trade and supply chains, and providing microfinance and guarantees for small businesses, benefiting many women entrepreneurs as well. ADB final support is designed hand in hand with our knowledge work, widely shared through report, blogs, webinars, and online symposium. The pandemic dramatically reinforced one important message. Most of our region's developing countries are not investing enough to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and address climate change. As you can see on the screen here, even before the onset of the pandemic, the region was off track to meet any of the 17 goals by 2030. It is particularly alarming that the trend on Goal 13 climate actions is in regressions instead of progress, despite being said that the global battle against climate change could be won or lost in Asia. Part of the challenge lies in the financing gap. Last year's UNESCAP Economic and Social Survey assessed that Asia-Pacific developing countries will need $1.5 trillion annually to end extreme poverty and ambitiously move toward universal health coverage, quality education, and infrastructure, while staying on track to limit climate change. When we reach a post-COVID-19 environment, the government's ability to mobilize funds to narrow this SDG financing gap will have considerably reduced even more. Bunching forward and not just bunching back would entail mobilizing larger domestic and external resources and building on strong global and inclusive partnership. Our Strategy 2030 and its 7 operational priorities are fully aligned with the SDGs. They include continuing to eradicate poverty and narrowing inequality. Gender equality is another priority. The vast majority of our projects and programs have built in the priority of climate change and environmental sustainability. Our goal is to reach by 2030 the targets of $80 billion in cumulative climate investment. The other priorities are on livable cities, rural development, governance, and regional cooperations. We are aware that a key to achieving these priorities lies in tapping the enormous potential of digital technologies. As we have all witnessed in 2020, the pandemic is accelerating the adoption of digital solutions, whether in finance, commerce, business, or transportation. We believe that the pandemic can be turned into an opportunity by deepening our understanding of emerging digital opportunities and risks, and gaining greater practical experience in applying digital solutions. To give some examples of ADB ongoing applications of digital solutions, let us look at the agriculture sector. We are implementing climate-smart agriculture projects, for example, piloting technologies using satellite imagery and artificial intelligence to quantify cultivation acreage for specific crops. Also, we are partnering with European and Japan space agencies to work on rice cultivations in the Philippines and coffee plantations in Timor-Leste. This data can be used to improve harvest forecasts and better target infrastructure investment across agriculture value chains. I would like to stress how Australia has remained an important partner in the implementations of our Strategy 2030. During the 3 past Asian Development Fund, or ADF negotiations, including the recently concluded ADF 13, Australia played a major role. But the significance of the partnership is not only evident in the continuous financial support. More importantly, Australia has helped shape ADB policies and approaches in the regions and deepen our knowledge work, which underpin the quality of ADB support. Our knowledge partnership with Australia accrue large benefits. We have formal agreements with 11 entities, ranging from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to the Institute of Global Finance, the Water Corporations, and Sydney Water, to name a few. ADB works with the academic and research partner, such as the Australian National University and Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organizations, is long-standing and remains strong. So let me conclude by once again congratulating the Asia Society Australia on today's launch. ADB look forward to working with you, and together we can assist Asia and the Pacific achieve sustainable development goals through speedy recovery, launching forward, and growing more resilient. Thank you.
Yeah, an important message there from ADB with Dr. Bambang. I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions and answers, but we will share all the questions with the speakers after the event. But before we go, I would like to ask both Anna and Pavan just quick comments and also perhaps call to action and a show of optimism about where we should be taking this climate action ahead of us. Anna, perhaps we can start with you as a closing comment.
Yes. In climate action terms, we talk about 2030, the next decade, as the point by which we must halve global emissions. It's all countries working together. This requires a rapid acceleration of investment, but it can be done. We do have the solutions. And so the confluence of this moment at the beginning of that decade, of 2020 arriving with COVID, means that there is this make or break chance now for the economic recovery investments to achieve the double goals of stimulating the economy while accelerating the investments into climate-aligned infrastructure so that we can halve worldwide emissions in that decade. We know it can be done, but it needs that surge and acceleration. So let's use this moment post-COVID to do as we've discussed today in this panel, and join us, please, in achieving that.
Okay, great. Pavan, are you also optimistic?
Yes,
Will we achieve our goal?
I am optimistic, but it'll need a change of heart and a change of purpose, I think, and I focus my comment and my call to action to Australia, a country with whom I have deep and long relationships since, for including 11 years spent as an employee of ANZ Bank. So my point is this, that WWF has put out, as you would have heard, a call to action which is about Regenerate Australia, and 2 out of those 4 planks in that call to action relate to energy. Renewables Nation is one of our calls to action. Another is Innovate and Regenerate. Honestly, Australia should become and should recognize its leadership position as an innovator and as a leader in renewable energy. You have the best human capital in this entire region. I mean, I'm myself, as a businessman, a consultant, when I had to advise some clients on pumped hydro energy storage in Asia, the paper that gave me the answers to my solutions was one published by the Australian National University in Canberra. When I look at the solutions for solar water heaters being used in China, amongst those are one generated by the University of Technology, Sydney. There's so much human capital which is completely, in my opinion, under-supported. It should become a problem solver for the whole of Asia, not just for Australia. And of course, as has been pointed out earlier by Anna as well as Helen, there's huge opportunity within Australia because of its high quality and quantity of solar irradiation, wind opportunity, and the land area. So there's no reason why Australia itself shouldn't be a renewable energy powerhouse. But my point is different. You should drive the transition in Asia. You have the opportunity. So to me, the fact that you don't do this is an enigma. And I mean, I'm just amazed at Australia's willingness as a commercial nation to suffer this opportunity loss for so long. Please stop doing this. This is not good for you. It's not good for the rest of Asia.
Yeah, certainly, it will be a good topic for our next panel discussion. But we don't have much time until 2030. We are running out of time, and we are already experiencing the negative impacts of climate change and global warming. And it does require all our efforts and all the countries' commitments if we want to achieve our ambitious targets. And thank you all very much, Anna and also Pavan, and thank you all for watching and joining our webcast today. And for your insights and perspectives are very, very important, and it's a kind of message that we need to listen to. So once again, thank you very much to our distinguished panelists. And that's all for today's discussion. Don't forget to check out Asia Society's new Disruptive Asia website, which is launched today. And here you'll find the 2020 essays, webcast, and the final publication. And we're also sharing that link with you in the chat box now. Once again, we'd like to thank our sponsors for this year's Disruptive Asia, WWF Australia, the University of Queensland, and the Judith Neilson's Institute for Journalism and Ideas. And also to our audience for joining us on this sustainable journey throughout 2020. I'm Desi Anwar from Jakarta. Thank you, and until next time, in the meantime, stay safe and stay healthy.